There is a 12-second moment in the very first Simpsons Halloween special where a haunted house, a supernatural force of pure evil that has terrorized every family who ever lived inside it, decides it would rather destroy itself than spend one more night with the Simpsons. The house does not lose a fight. Nobody defeats it. Nobody performs an exorcism or finds a magical solution. The house simply concludes that these particular people are more than it can handle and chooses to stop existing. That is the Treehouse of Horror in one image. 34 years, 33 Halloween specials, over 90 individual horror segments, one family that horror itself could not figure out what to do with. This video covers 10 of the most important cases from that tradition, the stories behind them, the real production details, and the fan theories that hold up under actual scrutiny. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's begin. The origin. Bad Dream House. October 25th, 1990. A Thursday night. Fox was still the scrappy fourth network that nobody fully trusted yet, and The Simpsons was barely a year old. The show had already done something no animated series had managed in decades. It had made adults genuinely laugh, not just tolerate a cartoon. But nobody knew what to do with Halloween. Nobody knew if a cartoon family could do horror. Nobody even knew if they should try. Matt Groening knew exactly where he wanted to go. Growing up, Groening had been obsessed with EC Comics, the horror comic books from the 1950s that had titles like Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and Shock Suspense Stories. These were comics that the United States government eventually tried to ban because parents were convinced they were rotting children's brains. The covers alone were genuinely disturbing. Monsters, murder, corpses rising from graves. They were not polite. They were not safe. And Groening loved them deeply. When he pitched the idea of a Halloween special to the writer's room, that was the spirit he was reaching for. Not a soft, family-friendly Halloween, something with actual teeth. The writers were not immediately convinced. The show had only just found its footing. They had a formula that was working. Homer being a lovable fool, Bart being a lovable troublemaker, Marge keeping everyone together. Why risk breaking the mood with something genuinely creepy? It took a while, as showrunner Al Jean later recalled, for the idea to settle into the room. But once it did, the show committed fully. The result was an episode that aired on October 25th, 1990, carrying the title The Simpsons Halloween Special, because nobody had figured out the Treehouse of Horror name yet. That would come later. For now, there were 3 stories, told by the kids in the backyard treehouse while Homer eavesdropped from below. The first of those 3 stories was Bad Dream House, and it was written by John Swartzwelder and directed by Wes Archer. The setup is as old as horror gets. A family moves into a new house. The house is suspiciously cheap. Bad things happen. The Simpsons find this house, move in, and almost immediately discover that something is wrong with it. Blood runs down the walls. There is a swirling vortex in the kitchen that leads to another dimension. The house is built on an old Native American burial ground. The house itself is possessed, and it starts talking, its voice provided by Harry Shearer, ordering the family to get out. What makes Bad Dream House interesting is how many horror films it manages to pack into a single short segment without any of them feeling forced. The look of the house is pulled directly from the Amityville Horror, the 1979 film based on the supposedly true story of a family driven from their home by demonic forces. The blood on the walls, the sense of evil that came with the land itself, all Amityville. The vortex in the kitchen, the house being built on a burial ground, the portal opening and swallowing things. That is Poltergeist, the 1982 film about a suburban family terrorized by spirits who want their youngest daughter. Even the way the house eventually dies, imploding in on itself, mirrors the ending of that film. The moment where Homer grabs an axe and comes for Marge is a direct nod to The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's horror film about a man driven to madness and murder in an isolated hotel. And Maggie's head spinning completely around on her shoulders is a reference to The Exorcist, the 1973 film about a young girl possessed by a demon, which is still considered one of the most frightening movies ever made. All of this in about 7 minutes of television. The show was not being lazy about its references. It knew exactly what it was doing, and it respected the source material enough to be specific about it. The humor in the segment comes from the family itself. When the house starts threatening them, Homer's response is casual indifference. When a vortex opens in the kitchen, he treats it as a mild inconvenience. Marge's concern is genuine and human, which makes the contrast funnier. The house takes over the minds of Homer and the children and drives them to pick up weapons and come after each other in the night. And then Marge, completely unaffected, simply talks them down. The supernatural force that could not be stopped by any horror movie protagonist is neutralized by a mother who just refuses to participate in it. Then comes the ending. The house, having failed to drive the family out through terror, chooses a different approach. It sits them all down and talks to them. It tries reasoning with them. It explains very clearly that they cannot stay. And the family, after thinking it over, decides to stay anyway. So the house makes a different calculation. It would rather destroy itself than exist alongside the Simpsons. It implodes, vanishes, and the family is left standing in an empty lot with nowhere to go. This ending matters more than it seems at first. The house is a supernatural force of pure evil that has terrorized everyone who ever lived in it, and the Simpsons are too much for it. Not because they are brave or clever or armed with holy water, because they are simply themselves, chaotic, stubborn, deeply committed to staying together, and that is more than the horror can handle. The show was making an argument in its very first Halloween segment about what the Simpsons actually are as a family. They are impervious not through strength, but through sheer density. Nothing can penetrate them because they are already too full of themselves to leave room for anything else. Marge also introduces the episode with a direct-to-camera warning that the content ahead may be too scary for children. This was itself a reference to the opening of the original 1931 Frankenstein film, where a representative of the studio steps in front of the curtain and warns the audience that what they are about to see is unusually disturbing. The Simpsons doing this in 1990 was both a joke and a genuine signal. The writers were aware they were stepping into horror territory. They were acknowledging the tradition they were joining, and they were doing it with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing exactly what you are referencing and why. The episode was also the first to feature music composed by Alf Clausen, who would go on to score the vast majority of Simpsons episodes for the next 27 years. His work here sets a template, music that can shift from comedic to genuinely unsettling within a single scene, never letting either tone overwhelm the other. The score for Bad Dream House specifically leans into the classical horror tradition, giving the segment a cinematic weight that the animation alone could not have achieved. In its original broadcast, the episode finished 25th in the ratings for the week of October 22nd to 28th, 1990, with a Nielsen rating of 15.7, meaning roughly 14.6 million households watched it. For a network like Fox, and for a show that was still technically in its second season, those numbers were significant. The gamble of doing a Halloween special had paid off. What the numbers could not measure was what had actually been built that night. The show had proven something important, that animation did not have to stay in its lane, that a cartoon could reference The Exorcist and The Shining in the same 7 minutes, play both for laughs and for something genuinely unsettling, and land both without cheapening either, that horror and comedy were not opposites, that the funniest version of a horror story was often the one that took the horror seriously. The writers had also, without fully planning it, created a format that would run for over 3 decades. 3 stories, a Halloween frame, characters free from the normal rules of the show, no consequences, no canon, the freedom to kill anyone, destroy anything, go anywhere the horror genre had ever been. The Treehouse of Horror was not just a Halloween special. It was a parallel universe that opened up once a year and let the show be something it could never be otherwise. And it started with a house that hated the Simpsons so much, it would rather not exist than share a zip code with them. Bad Dream House is the foundation. Everything that comes after it, the aliens, the devil, the 3D dimension, the cannibalistic teachers, all of it is built on the confidence established in those 7 minutes in 1990. The confidence that this show could walk into the darkest rooms in horror history and find something worth saying there. There is one more character from that first episode who deserves attention before moving on, because he showed up in all 3 segments that night, and his presence changed what the show was able to do on a creative level. James Earl Jones. Jones played the moving man in Bad Dream House, Serac the Preparer in Hungry Are the Damned, and the narrator of The Raven. 3 different roles in a single episode, each one requiring a completely different register. His voice, one of the most recognizable in American entertainment, the voice of Darth Vader, the voice that could make a phone book sound like scripture, brought a gravity to the material that no other guest could have provided. When Jones narrates The Raven, the Poe poem lands as actual literature inside a cartoon. When Jones voices an alien chef preparing the Simpsons for what may or may not be a meal, the joke is funnier because the voice is so serious. He was not winking at the audience. He was committing. Matt Groening admitted on the Season 2 DVD commentary that he had been terrified the Raven segment was the worst, most pretentious thing the show had ever done. He was afraid they had wandered too far from comedy, too far into sincerity, and that the audience would reject it. Instead, it became one of the most praised things the show had ever produced. His snotty, intellectual New York friends, Groening noted with obvious satisfaction, gave it their seal of approval. That fear of going too far toward sincerity, of being too earnest, is something the show would wrestle with across its entire run. The Treehouse of Horror gave it a space where sincerity was protected by the Halloween frame. Nobody could accuse the show of being pretentious when the episode opened with Marge warning parents to put their children to bed. The horror label was a kind of cover. Under it, the writers could be as genuine as they wanted. That is what Bad Dream House gave the show. Not just a Halloween special, a permission slip. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens in the very next segment of that same first episode is where things get stranger, funnier, and significantly more important to the show's long-term identity. 2 creatures are introduced. Drooling, one-eyed, vaguely tentacled, and the Simpsons will never fully be rid of them again. Section 2. The Birth of Kang and Kodos. Hungry Are the Damned. The Simpsons had been on the air for less than 2 full seasons when 2 creatures showed up that nobody planned to keep around. Kang and Kodos were created by writers Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski for that first Halloween special in 1990. The initial drawing came from those 2 writers, and the finished design was built from an EC Comics cover, one of those old horror comic book covers that Groening had grown up loving. The result was a pair of creatures that looked like nothing else on television at the time. Green bodies, 1 giant eye each, mouths full of drool that never seemed to stop. Tentacles where arms should be, transparent helmets on their heads so they could breathe Earth's air. They came from a planet called Rigel 7, and they spoke English, which the show explained was a remarkable coincidence, since their native language of Rigelian happened to be identical to English in every way. Harry Shearer voiced Kang. Dan Castellaneta, the same man who voiced Homer, voiced Kodos. Nobody made a decision to keep them. There was no meeting meeting where executives said these two aliens need to come back every year. What happened was simpler and stranger than that. Showrunner Al Jean, in the Season 9 DVD commentary, credited executive producer Sam Simon with the idea of requiring Kang and Kodos to appear in every single Treehouse of Horror episode going forward. That one decision, made early, made casually, turned two creatures from a throwaway Halloween segment into the most consistent presence in the show's entire horror anthology tradition. They have appeared in every single Treehouse of Horror episode across all 36 installments. Sometimes they drive the main story. Sometimes they show up for 10 seconds and say nothing important. But they are always there, no exceptions. The segment that introduced them, Hungry Are the Damned, was a direct parody of a Twilight Zone episode called To Serve Man, which had aired in 1962. The original Twilight Zone story was about aliens who arrive on Earth claiming to want to help humanity. They share their technology. They seem friendly. They hand over a book titled To Serve Man, which scientists work to decode, assuming it contains alien wisdom. The twist, delivered in the final moments, is that it is a cookbook. The aliens have been fattening humanity up for consumption. The Simpsons took that premise and twisted it in the opposite direction. In Hungry Are the Damned, the Simpson family is abducted from their backyard by Kang, Kodos, and a third alien named Serac the Preparer, voiced by James Earl Jones. The aliens are generous hosts. They give the Simpsons enormous amounts of food. Homer eats everything put in front of him with complete enthusiasm, which is accurate to his character. The family is fed constantly, given comfortable quarters, and treated with great care. But Lisa starts to get suspicious. All this feeding feels wrong to her. She goes looking for answers. She finds a book. The title appears to read, How to Cook Humans. This is the moment the segment should follow the Twilight Zone into darkness. Lisa has found the cookbook. The aliens are going to eat them. The horror lands. Except Lisa is not done reading. She blows some dust off the cover. The title changes. It now reads, How to Cook for 40 Humans. More dust. The full title reveals itself. How to Cook for 40 Humans. The book is a recipe collection for feeding large groups of people, not a guide to eating them. Lisa has accused innocent aliens of planning to murder and consume her family, and she was completely wrong. The aliens, whose feelings are genuinely hurt by this accusation, turn the ship around and take the Simpsons home. As the family is deposited back in their yard, one of the aliens makes an observation. He says, the real monsters were aboard the ship all along. He means Lisa. He means the family. Their suspicion and ingratitude, in the face of nothing but kindness, made them the problem. Groening had wanted to extend the joke even further. His original instinct was for the title to keep going, How to Cook for 40 Humans and Then Eat Them, so that the audience would be kept off balance even longer, never quite sure which reading was correct. That version did not make it to air, but the instinct behind it reveals something about how the segment was conceived. The goal was not simply to parody To Serve Man. The goal was to undermine the audience's assumptions at every level. The Twilight Zone's version of this story punishes humanity's trust. The Simpsons version punishes humanity's suspicion. Both versions end with the humans looking foolish, but for opposite reasons. This inversion is what makes Hungry Are the Damned more than a quick parody. The segment is genuinely interested in the question of who gets to be the monster. In the original story, the monsters are the aliens who pretend to be friendly. In the Simpsons version, the monsters are the humans who cannot accept friendship without looking for the angle. Lisa, the most intellectually curious and morally serious character in the family, is the one who poisons the relationship. Her intelligence and her suspicion are the same thing in this segment, and both of them lead to a bad outcome. It is worth being clear about the names Kang and Kodos and the name Serac, because they are not random. All three names are references to Star Trek characters. The show's writing staff in the early years had a significant overlap with people who were deeply familiar with science fiction, and the names were a quiet nod to that tradition. Kang is the name of a Klingon villain from the original Star Trek series. Kodos is the name of the governor of Tarsus IV, a mass murderer from a famous Star Trek episode called The Conscience of the King. Serac is a Vulcan name. The aliens were science fiction references dressed up as horror characters. Kang and Kodos drool constantly. This was not an accident. The drool was a visual choice that served a specific purpose. It made the aliens look vaguely dangerous, even when they were being kind. A creature that cannot stop producing saliva reads, at some instinctive level, as predatory. The show understood this and used it deliberately. Every time Kang or Kodos appears to be doing something benign, the drool is still there, reminding the audience that something is slightly off. In Hungry Are the Damned, this visual creates genuine tension in the early part of the segment, before the reveal that the tension was misplaced. The voices matter enormously here. Harry Shearer and Dan Castellaneta are both doing broad theatrical performances, deep, rolling vowels, a slightly formal cadence, that feel nothing like their regular characters. Shearer's Homer is warm and bumbling. Shearer's Kang is commanding. Castellaneta's Homer is loud and impulsive. Castellaneta's Kodos is measured and slightly ominous. The contrast between these performances and their normal work is part of what makes Kang and Kodos feel genuinely separate from the rest of the show's cast, despite being voiced by two of its main actors. James Earl Jones as Serac the Preparer adds another layer. Jones voices the alien, who actually does most of the cooking and caretaking, the one who seems most directly responsible for the family's well-being aboard the ship. His voice, massive and serious, makes every line of dialogue sound more significant than it probably is. When Serac says something reassuring, it sounds like a promise. When he says something threatening, even gently, it sounds like a verdict. Jones was not playing the role for laughs. He was playing it straight, and the comedy came from the gap between his delivery and the absurdity of the situation. What happened to Serac the Preparer after this episode is notable, or rather, what did not happen. He never appeared again in any canon Treehouse of Horror segment. Kang and Kodos returned every year without fail. Serac was left behind. The show never explained why. He simply stopped existing in the Halloween universe, and nobody seemed to notice or mourn his absence. This is consistent with how the Treehouse of Horror treats its own continuity, which is to say, it does not treat it at all. Nothing that happens in one Halloween episode carries over to the next. Characters die and return. Rules are made and immediately forgotten. Serac the Preparer appeared once, served his purpose, and the show moved on. The segment ends with the Simpson family back in their yard, and the aliens' parting words hanging in the air. They were the monsters. The family does not seem particularly bothered by this assessment. Homer resumes eating. Life continues. That ending is funnier than it has any right to be, and it works because the show has established something about its main characters that will remain true for the entire run of the series. The Simpsons are not capable of sustained shame. They can be accused of being the worst people in a given situation, accept the accusation without much resistance, and then walk away and do something completely different. This is not stupidity, though it sometimes looks like it. It is a kind of resilience that borders on imperviousness. The aliens can call them monsters. The haunted house can prefer destruction over coexistence with them. The devil can try to drag Homer to hell. None of it sticks. The family absorbs whatever is thrown at them and continues. This is actually the central joke of the entire Treehouse of Horror tradition, and Hungry Are the Damned is the first place it appears clearly. The horror in these episodes is never quite able to defeat The Simpsons, because The Simpsons are more chaotic, more stubborn, and more thoroughly themselves than any supernatural force can account for. The ghost, the monster, the alien, they all have rules. The Simpsons do not operate by rules, and so they consistently win encounters they have no logical reason to survive. The decision to bring Kang and Kodos back every year was, in retrospect, one of the most significant creative choices the Treehouse of Horror series ever made. Not because the two aliens are the most interesting or complex characters the show ever produced. They are not. They are simple. They want to conquer Earth. They occasionally succeed, briefly. They are usually thwarted or simply move on. Their dialogue is broad and theatrical and designed for maximum comedic impact in short segments. They are not built for depth. What they provide is something different from depth. They provide consistency. In a series of episodes that deliberately have no continuity, no consequences, and no canon, Kang and Kodos are the one thread that connects all of them. Every Halloween, no matter what the segments are about, no matter which horror films are being parodied, or which characters are being killed, or which dark corners of the genre are being explored, those two drooling aliens are going to show up somewhere. They are the show's way of saying that this is still the same tradition. This is still the same universe, no matter how strange things get. They are also, in a way the show has never made fully explicit, but has clearly understood for decades, the show's honest take on what it means to be an outsider. Kang and Kodos want something from Earth. Usually it's conquest, occasionally a good meal, and they are never able to get it. They are too alien to succeed, and too persistent to give up. They come back every year and try again. Every year, it does not work. The audience knows this going in, and yet their segments remain funny because the gap between how seriously the aliens take their plans and how poorly those plans go is genuinely, reliably funny every single time. By the time the show reached its 7th Treehouse of Horror in 1996, Kang and Kodos would finally get an entire segment of their own, and the target they would choose would be not one family, not one city, but the entire United States presidential election. That segment, called Citizen Kang, is one of the most quoted pieces of political comedy the show ever produced. But that comes later. For now, in 1990, the two creatures have just been born, and the family they tried to cook is already walking away unbothered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The third and final segment of that first Halloween special was the one that made Groening most nervous, and the one that ended up proving definitively that The Simpsons could do something no other animated show on television had ever attempted. A dead poet, a talking bird, Homer Simpson reading one of the most famous poems in the English language, and a director who was not entirely sure any of it was going to work. Section 3. The Raven. There is a moment in the production of the first Treehouse of Horror episode where Matt Groening, watching the finished cut of the third segment, became genuinely convinced he had made a terrible mistake. The segment was called The Raven. It was an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's 1845 poem of the same name, one of the most famous pieces of writing in American history. A long, dark, rhythmic poem about a man who is visited in the night by a black bird that will only say one word. The man in the poem has lost the woman he loved, a woman named Lenore, and the bird's single repeated word, nevermore, slowly destroys him, because he keeps asking it questions he does not want the answers to. By the end of the poem, the man is broken. The bird is still there. There is no resolution, no comfort, no morning after the darkness. The poem ends in despair and stays there. This was what the Simpsons writing staff decided decided to adapt for their very first Halloween special. Groening's fear was specific. He looked at the segment and saw almost no jokes. The Raven was being played seriously. James Earl Jones was narrating the poem with full commitment, his enormous voice giving every line its proper weight. Homer was being animated as the poem's tormented narrator, moving through a dark room filled with shadow and dread. Marge appeared as Lenore, the lost woman. Bart appeared as the Raven itself, perched on a bust above the door. The animation was careful and cinematic. Nothing was winking at the audience. Nothing was undercutting the mood for a cheap laugh. Groening, as he later admitted on the Season 2 DVD commentary, was terrified. He felt certain the segment was the worst, most pretentious thing the show had ever done. He was afraid the audience would reject it, that they had come for a Halloween cartoon and instead been handed serious literature delivered with a straight face by one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment. He was wrong. But the fact that he was afraid of it reveals something important about what the Raven actually accomplished. The segment was written by Sam Simon, one of the 3 original developers of the show, alongside Groening and James L. Brooks. Simon's approach was not to parody the poem. He adapted it faithfully, keeping Poe's actual words largely intact, and then placed the Simpsons characters inside that faithful adaptation. Homer is the narrator. He feels everything the narrator feels. He is genuinely disturbed by the bird. He is genuinely grieving something, or trying to grieve something, even if the show never quite specifies what. The comedy does not come from undermining the poem. It comes from the collision between the poem's grandeur and Homer's specific personality. Director David Silverman recalled that executive producer James L. Brooks, watching early cuts, felt the segment needed more humor. Brooks suggested one specific addition, Bart, as the Raven, saying his catchphrase. In the finished segment, the Raven does occasionally punctuate the poem's darkness, with Bart's voice saying, "Eat my shorts." This is the one major comedic insertion into the poem itself, and it works not because it destroys the mood, but because it captures something true about how Homer Simpson relates to misery. Even in his darkest moments, Bart is there, making things worse, and Homer has learned to absorb it. Silverman also spoke about the visual choices he made throughout the segment. One of his favorite shots was the Raven's point of view, the camera placing the audience behind the bird's eyes, looking down at Homer as the Raven flies around the room. This is a genuinely cinematic choice. Most animated shows in 1990 did not think in terms of camera perspective the way live-action film did. Silverman was applying film grammar to animation, and the result gave the segment a visual sophistication that separated it from everything else on television at the time. The performances were the heart of it. James Earl Jones narrated the poem with no irony whatsoever. He treated Poe's words as the serious, heavy literature they are. His voice, which carries a natural authority that very few human voices possess, made every stanza feel like a verdict. When Jones reads "Nevermore," it sounds final. It sounds like a door closing. It sounds like something being taken away that is never coming back. He was not performing for a cartoon. He was performing for the poem, and the cartoon was built around him. Dan Castellaneta, voicing Homer as the poem's narrator, found something genuinely affecting in the performance. Silverman, in later interviews, praised Castellaneta's work in the segment specifically. What Castellaneta managed was a version of Homer that was still recognizably Homer, still capable of bewilderment, still prone to outbursts, still fundamentally himself, but who was also carrying real emotion. Homer in The Raven is frightened, he is confused, he is desperate, and underneath all of that, he is sad, in a way that the regular show rarely gave Homer space to be. The grief in Poe's poem transferred, through Castellaneta's performance, into something that felt genuine rather than parodic. The animation itself made choices that rewarded close attention. The room Homer inhabits is large, dark, and full of shadow. The lighting shifts across the segment in ways that track the emotional movement of the poem. Darker as Homer becomes more desperate, the single candle flame the only warmth in an increasingly cold space. The raven sits on a bust above the doorframe and does not move from that spot. It watches. It waits. It says its word. This stillness was a deliberate choice. In a medium where everything is always moving, a character that simply sits and watches carries a specific kind of threat. Bart as the Raven is the segment's most elegant visual idea. Bart Simpson in the regular show is the character who refuses to be controlled, who resists authority, who always has something to say and usually says the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Placing him as the Raven, a creature that will only say one word, a word that destroys its listener, is a perfect translation of what Bart does to Homer in the normal universe. In everyday Simpsons episodes, Bart drives Homer to distraction through constant noise and chaos. In The Raven, Bart drives Homer to the edge of sanity through a single repeated syllable. The joke is structural. It does not need to be explained because it is already true to both characters. Marge as Lenore appears only briefly in the narrator's memory, a figure of warmth in contrast to the cold darkness of the present. This is also true to the regular show. Marge is the emotional center that Homer orbits. In The Raven, as in the normal Simpsons universe, she is the warmth that makes Homer's life worth living, and her absence, even a remembered, imagined absence, is what undoes him. The segment aired and the response was not the rejection Groening feared. The Raven became one of the most praised things the first Treehouse of Horror produced. Critics noted it, Poe scholars noted it, teachers started showing it in classrooms as a way into the actual poem. Groening received what he called the seal of approval from his snotty, intellectual New York friends, and he noted this with obvious satisfaction. The segment that he was most afraid of turned out to be the one that demonstrated most clearly what the show was capable of at its best. What The Raven proved, beyond the specific quality of the segment itself, was that The Simpsons could work with serious material without condescending to it, and without being condescended to for using it. The show did not have to stay in the lane of broad comedy about a dysfunctional family. It could walk into the darkest, most respected corners of American literature, bring Homer Simpson with it, and come out the other side with something that honored both the original work and its own identity. That is an extremely difficult thing to do. Most parody flattens its source material in the process of making fun of it. The Raven did not flatten Poe. It took Poe seriously, placed him in an animated world, and found that the two things were compatible in ways nobody had anticipated. There is a specific quality to Poe's poem that made it a natural fit for the Simpsons universe, even if this was not fully conscious at the time. The narrator of The Raven is a man who asks questions he cannot stop asking, even though the answers are destroying him. He knows the bird can only say nevermore. He knows that asking whether Lenore waits in heaven will produce an answer that wrecks him. He asks anyway. He keeps going. He cannot stop. This compulsion, the inability to leave something alone, to stop poking at a wound, to keep returning to the source of pain, is deeply true to Homer Simpson as a character. Homer, in hundreds of episodes across decades of television, is a man who keeps making the same kinds of mistakes, keeps returning to the same situations, keeps asking for trouble in the same specific ways. He cannot stop. The Raven's narrator and Homer share this quality. The adaptation works so well, partly because the character Groening created and the character Poe created are at some level recognizably the same kind of person. The segment ends with the poem ending, the narrator overwhelmed, the Raven still there, the darkness permanent. Then the camera pulls back to the treehouse, where Lisa has finished telling the story. Bart and Maggie are asleep. The Raven sits in the corner, watching. Homer, who has been listening from outside the treehouse the whole time, admits that the story scared him. He is a grown man frightened by his children's ghost story. This is the joke that closes the segment and the episode, and it is the right joke because it brings the horror back to the domestic scale, back to the family, back to the specific and ordinary world that makes The Simpsons The Simpsons. The Raven also marked the last time for several years that the show would attempt anything quite so directly earnest in a Treehouse of Horror context. The Halloween specials that followed leaned more heavily into comedy and parody, found different ways to blend horror with humor, and generally kept the two at a safer distance from each other. The sincerity of The Raven was not abandoned, it was stored. The show knew it could go there. It chose, for a while, to go other places instead. The critical reception of that first Treehouse of Horror episode established something that would shape every Halloween special that followed. The show learned that Halloween gave it permission to be ambitious. The Raven had been the most ambitious thing in the episode, and it had been the most rewarded. Going forward, the writers knew that the horror frame was not a limitation, it was an invitation. An invitation to adapt Poe, to parody Kubrick, to put Homer in a three-dimensional universe, to make the devil look like the next-door neighbor, to let the school cafeteria turn into something genuinely dark and bloody and honest about what institutions do to the people inside them. All of that came later, but it came because The Raven showed it was possible. One detail from the production of that first episode that tends to get overlooked, the segment was also the first time the show's music, composed by Alf Clausen, was asked to carry something truly serious. Clausen's score for The Raven does not play the material for laughs. It supports the poem's mood with the same commitment that Jones brought to the narration. The music and the voice and the animation are all pointed in the same direction, all taking Poe seriously, all trusting that the audience can hold two things at once: the fact that this is a cartoon about a yellow family, and the fact that this particular 7 minutes is actually about grief and loss, and the way a person can be undone by a question they cannot stop asking. The audience held both things at once. They always can when the show trusts them enough to try. Groening's snotty intellectual friends gave their approval. The teachers started using it in class. The critics wrote it into their best of lists. And Homer Simpson, yellow and round and terrified by a cartoon bird, accidentally became one of the most emotionally honest readings of a 19th century American poem that anyone had ever put on television. That is an extraordinary thing for a Halloween cartoon to accomplish in its first attempt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 years after The Raven, the show returned to the Treehouse of Horror with an episode that many people still consider the single best Halloween special in the series' entire history. It introduced the devil in the form of the most wholesome man in Springfield, sent Homer to a courtroom in hell, put Bart on the side of a school bus in a thunderstorm with something that nobody else could see, and ended with a vampire reveal that nobody saw coming. The writer responsible for the wraparound segments that held the whole thing together was leaving the show the following week to host a late-night television program. He wrote his final Simpsons script as a Halloween special, and it became one of the most beloved episodes the show ever made. Section 4. The Devil Wears Flanders. The Devil and Homer Simpson. By October of 1993, The Simpsons was the most important show on American television. That is not an overstatement. The show had spent 3 seasons rewriting the rules of what a primetime animated series could be. It had proven that animation was not just for children, that a cartoon family could carry real emotional weight, that comedy could be sharp and strange and layered without losing a mass audience. Fox had built its entire Thursday night lineup around it. The Simpsons was not just popular, it was the thing other shows measured themselves against. So when the 5th season arrived and Treehouse of Horror 4 was announced, the expectations were enormous. The writing staff knew this, and the particular group of writers who assembled that episode rose to it in a way that has not been equaled in the 20-plus Treehouse of Horror specials that followed. The episode aired on October 28, 1993. It was directed by David Silverman, who had directed The Raven 3 years earlier, and brought the same visual commitment to this installment. The episode was structured around a wraparound segment, Bart walking through a gallery of paintings in a parody of Rod Serling's Night Gallery, a real television show from the early 1970s, where Serling would introduce horror stories by presenting paintings in an art gallery. In the Simpsons version, Bart is the host, walking through an underground gallery lit by candles, introducing each story by gesturing at the relevant painting on the wall. Those wraparound segments were written by Conan O'Brien. O'Brien had been a staff writer on The Simpsons since the 3rd season, and the Night Gallery wraparounds in Treehouse of Horror 4 were the last thing he wrote for the show before leaving to become the host of Late Night with Conan O'Brien on NBC. He was 29 years old. He had been a writer since college, had worked briefly at Saturday Night Live, and had spent 2 years in The Simpsons writer's room, becoming one of the most respected voices in that space. His departure was significant, and his final contribution to the show was a set of wraparound segments for a Halloween special that would be remembered as one of the greatest episodes in the show's history. The 3 stories in Treehouse of Horror 4 were The Devil and Homer Simpson, Terror at 5.5 Feet, and Bart Simpson's Dracula. The Devil and Homer Simpson was written by Greg Daniels and Dan McGrath. The premise is simple in the way that the best comedy premises always are. Homer sells his soul to the devil for a donut. Not for wealth, not for power, not for fame or beauty or any of the things that people in soul-selling stories traditionally want. Homer sells his soul for a donut. And then, in the moment that makes the segment genuinely great, he almost outsmarts the deal. He decides that as long as he does not finish the donut, the devil cannot have his soul. He eats almost the entire thing, leaves a small piece, and puts it in the refrigerator for safekeeping. Then, in the middle of the night, half asleep, Homer wanders to the refrigerator and eats the last piece of the donut. He does not even make a conscious choice. He just eats it, the way Homer always eats things, and then realizes what he has done. The devil arrives to collect. The devil in this segment is Ned Flanders. This casting choice, and in animation, every casting choice is a writing choice, a deliberate decision about what the character looks like and sounds like and feels like, is the single most important creative decision the segment makes. Ned Flanders is Homer's neighbor. He is the most aggressively Christian character in the show, a man who quotes scripture, who prays earnestly, who maintains a relentlessly positive attitude toward everyone around him, who is genuinely kind in a way that Homer finds deeply irritating. Ned Flanders is Springfield's most visible good person. Making him the devil is not just a joke. The joke is the surface. Underneath it, the casting reveals something true about how the segment understands evil. The devil, in this telling, does not look like what people expect evil to look like. He looks like the most pleasant, most helpful, most sincerely nice person in the neighborhood. He smiles. He uses polite language. He is perfectly reasonable in all his dealings. He is willing to negotiate. He holds a fair trial. He follows the rules of whatever agreement was made. And all of this pleasantness and reasonableness and helpfulness is in service of taking Homer's soul and delivering him to eternal suffering. The devil's niceness is not a disguise for his evil. His niceness and his evil coexist completely comfortably. He is a genuinely pleasant entity who also wants to drag Homer to hell, and he sees no contradiction between these two things. This is a more sophisticated understanding of how evil operates in the real world than most horror stories manage. The monster who looks like a monster is frightening, but not particularly interesting. The pleasant neighbor who turns out to be perfectly happy to destroy you is something else entirely. Homer is taken to hell while the trial is being arranged. What happens to him there is one of the funniest sequences the show has ever produced. Homer is strapped to a table and force-fed donuts by a demon. This is meant to be torture. The demon keeps bringing more donuts, an endless supply, a punishment designed to overwhelm and sicken. Homer eats every single one with complete happiness. The demon runs out of donuts. Homer looks at the demon and asks what is next. The demon, visibly disturbed, has no answer. Homer has broken the torture through the simple application of being exactly who he is. This moment, like the haunted house choosing to implode rather than coexist with the Simpsons, and like the aliens calling the family monsters for their ingratitude, is the show articulating one of its central truths in horror language. Homer Simpson cannot be meaningfully punished because he genuinely enjoys most of what punishment throws at him. He is not brave, he is not strong. He simply has such a complete and cheerful relationship with his own appetites that the systems designed to make people suffer through those appetites have nothing to work with. The trial scene follows. Marge appeals to the devil, to Ned Flanders, smiling pleasantly, making reasonable arguments for why Homer's soul belongs to him, and negotiates a jury trial in hell. The jury is made up of damned historical figures. Among them is Benedict Arnold, the American general who betrayed his country during the Revolutionary War. There is also a figure presented as Richard Nixon, notable because Nixon was still alive when the episode aired, and died just a few months later in April of 1994. The jury, made up of history's villains and traitors, listens to the case. Marge wins. She wins not on a legal technicality, and not through any supernatural intervention. She wins by showing the jury a photograph from her wedding to Homer, which she carries in her purse. The photograph shows Homer with a note written on a napkin at their wedding, where he promised his soul to Marge before he ever sold it to the devil. The soul was already spoken for. Ned Flanders, the devil, is bound by the rules of his own agreement. He cannot take what was already given to someone else. He is forced to release Homer. But he is not gracious about it. Before leaving, the devil turns Homer's head into a donut, a final petty act, a small revenge for the inconvenience. Homer, his head now a giant donut, is immediately in danger of eating himself. The episode ends with Homer nibbling at his own head, perfectly content, while the family watches in mild concern. The trial scene is one of the most purely enjoyable pieces of writing in the entire series. The segment understands that the funniest version of a courtroom in hell is one that takes the legal procedures seriously. The devil does not cheat, the jury deliberates, the rules are followed. What makes it funny is that ordinary domestic love, a photograph from a wedding, a note on a napkin, is legally binding in hell and more powerful than any supernatural claim. Marge's commitment to Homer is not presented as a grand romantic gesture. It is presented as a fact, as solid and reliable as a contract, and it holds up in the most adversarial legal environment imaginable. Terror at 5.5 Feet was the second segment, written by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. It was a direct parody of a famous Twilight Zone episode from 1963 called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, in which a man on an airplane sees a creature on the wing that nobody else can see. The Simpsons version places Bart on a school bus in a thunderstorm, where he sees a small, malicious gremlin on the side of the bus, tearing the vehicle apart. Nobody believes him. The bus driver ignores him. His classmates think he has lost his mind. Bart escalates his attempts to deal with the gremlin, eventually throwing a safety flare out the window at it, which damages the bus, and is taken away in a straitjacket at the end of the segment, his warnings completely unheeded. The final shot of the segment shows Ned Flanders driving home from the incident, the gremlin sitting on the back of his car and grinning. Bart was right. He was always right. The creature was real. Nobody listened, and the consequence of not listening has been transferred to the most convenient available target, which is Ned Flanders, who has been on the receiving end of bad outcomes in this episode since the opening segment. The gremlin in this segment was voiced by Frank Welker, a professional voice actor who has specialized in creature and animal sounds across decades of film and television. The casting of a dedicated creature voice actor, rather than a regular cast member, gave the gremlin a quality of genuine strangeness that separated it from the rest of the episode's audio landscape. It sounds like something that does not belong in the world it occupies, which is exactly what it is. Bart Simpson's Dracula was the third segment, written by Bill Canterbury. It was a parody of the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola film Bram Stoker's Dracula, which had been a major theatrical release the previous year. In the segment, Mr. Burns is revealed to be a vampire who has lured the family to his estate in Pennsylvania. Burns as Dracula is a natural fit. The character was already drawn as gaunt, pale, ancient, and entirely willing to drain the life from the people around him, so the vampire costume required almost no adjustment. The segment ends with a twist that genuinely catches the audience off guard. After Bart is turned into a vampire and the family must confront the situation, the real master vampire, the one who turned Burns, is revealed to be Marge. The suburban wife and mother, the most normal and stabilizing presence in the family, is the head vampire. The show immediately undercuts this reveal by having Marge note that it doesn't make any sense, before cutting to the family celebrating Christmas in a spoof of the ending of the Peanuts television special, A Charlie Brown Christmas, complete with the specific music and visual style of that show. It is a joke about horror conventions, about twist endings, about the Peanuts special, and about The Simpsons' own tendency to resolve things imperfectly, all at the same time. The episode as a whole finished 17th in the ratings for the week of October 25th to 31st, 1993, with a Nielsen rating of 14.5, 13.6 million households, and was the highest rated show on the Fox network that week. Critical reception was strongly positive. The book titled, "I Can't Believe It's a Bigger and Better Updated Unofficial Simpsons Guide," called the episode probably the best Treehouse of Horror ever made, singling out the hell punishment scenes and Chief Wiggum's attempt to deal with Dracula by ordering the destruction of the Egyptian wing of the Springfield Museum. That last detail, Wiggum identifying Dracula as a mummy and responding accordingly, with total confidence and complete incorrectness, is the show in miniature. Authority figures in Springfield do not understand the problems they are supposed to solve. They apply confident, decisive action to situations they have fundamentally misread. The problem continues. The authority figure feels good about their response. This pattern runs through 30-plus years of Simpsons episodes, and Treehouse of Horror 4 puts it in horror clothing where it becomes, briefly, a matter of life and death. Conan O'Brien left the show the following week to begin his television career. He went on to host Late Night, then The Tonight Show, then his own program on TBS, becoming one of the most recognizable figures in American late-night television for the next 30 years. The last thing he wrote for The Simpsons was a set of wraparound segments for a Halloween special that has been called one of the greatest episodes in the show's history. That is a good final entry on any television resume. The episode also confirmed, 3 years after the first Treehouse of Horror, that the Halloween tradition was not a lucky accident. The show knew how to do this. It knew how to build horror stories that were also comedy stories, how to parody source material it genuinely respected, how to use its characters in ways that felt true to who they were, even in wildly different contexts. The devil is Ned Flanders. because Ned and the devil share a quality, relentless pleasantness in pursuit of a fixed goal, that the regular show had been quietly establishing for years. Bart sees something real that nobody believes him about because the regular show had established Bart as someone whose warnings tend to be ignored until it is too late. Mr. Burns is Dracula because Mr. Burns had always been Dracula. The horror in Treehouse of Horror 4 works because it is built from character, and the characters were already there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The following year, the show produced what is now almost universally considered the single greatest Treehouse of Horror episode ever made. 3 segments, each one a landmark in its own right. A writer who had not yet contributed a single Simpsons story before this episode would use his very first script to write what many fans consider the darkest, most genuinely disturbing thing the show has ever put on screen. And a running gag about an axe and a Scottish groundskeeper would tie the whole thing together in a way that should not have worked, but absolutely did. Section 5, The Shinning. October 30th, 1994. Season 6 of The Simpsons. The show was at the peak of its creative power, and everyone involved knew it. Treehouse of Horror 5 was the 6th episode of that 6th season, and it aired the night before Halloween. It was directed by Jim Reardon. The episode was written by 4 different people. Bob Cushel wrote The Shinning, Greg Daniels and Dan McGrath wrote Time and Punishment, and David X. Cohen wrote Nightmare Cafeteria. Cohen had never written a Simpsons script before. Nightmare Cafeteria was his first. The episode featured James Earl Jones returning for his second Treehouse of Horror appearance, this time as the voice of an alternate timeline version of Maggie. It also featured Marcia Wallace as Edna Krabappel. Before any of the stories began, Marge appeared on screen to warn the audience. The episode was frightening, she explained, and children should not watch it. This disclaimer had appeared in various forms since the first Treehouse of Horror, but this time the show added a second layer. As Marge delivered her warning, a voice cut in to inform her that the episode was so scary that Congress would not allow them to show it. The show was already playing with the idea of its own restrictions, its own relationship with television standards, its own awareness of being watched and judged. It was a joke, but it was also a signal. The episode that followed would be deliberately, purposefully more violent and disturbing than anything the Treehouse of Horror had done before. Showrunner David Merkin made that choice consciously. The Simpsons had been receiving complaints about excessive violence, ironic given how much of the show's comedy had always relied on cartoon physical harm. And Merkin's response was to put more graphic violence in the Halloween special, not less. This was not recklessness. It was a specific creative argument. The horror frame exists precisely so the show can go to places it cannot go in regular episodes. If complaints about violence were going to arrive regardless, the show might as well earn them by doing something genuinely interesting with the material. Treehouse of Horror 5 also made a structural change from the previous specials. The show dropped the wraparound segments entirely, the framing devices that had connected the stories in earlier installments. The decision was made to use that time for the main stories instead. 3 segments, no connective tissue, just story after story with the Halloween credits at the top and the Gracie Films logo at the end. This made the episode feel different from its predecessors, more direct, more committed, less interested in stepping back from its own material. The running gag that tied the 3 segments together was groundskeeper Willie being killed in each one. In every segment, someone hits Willie in the back with an axe while he is attempting to help someone. The gag is consistent across all 3 stories. Same action, same outcome, same character. But the context shifts each time. In The Shinning, Willie is trying to help Bart. In Time and Punishment, he tries to help Homer. In Nightmare Cafeteria, he tries to help Bart and Lisa. Every attempt to help results in the same death. The joke accumulates across the episode and becomes, by the third instance, both funnier and somehow more disturbing. Willie is defined by his willingness to intervene on behalf of others, and by the absolute certainty that this willingness will destroy him. The Shining was written by Bob Cushell, and it was a direct, scene-by-scene parody of Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film The Shining, which was itself based on the 1977 novel of the same name by Stephen King. The original film is about a man named Jack Torrance, who takes a job as the winter caretaker of an isolated hotel in the mountains, bringing his wife and young son with him. The hotel is haunted. Jack, who has a history of violence and alcoholism, gradually loses his mind under the influence of the hotel's evil and attempts to murder his family. The film is one of the most studied and discussed horror movies ever made, famous for its imagery, its performances, and its overwhelming sense of dread. The Simpsons version places Homer in the Jack Torrance role, Marge in the role of Jack's wife, and Bart in the role of Danny, Jack's son, who has a psychic ability in the original film called The Shining that allows him to communicate over distance and sense danger. The Simpsons version calls this ability the Shinning, specifically to avoid getting sued, as groundskeeper Willie explains to Bart before the axe arrives in his back. The setup follows the original film's structure faithfully. Mr. Burns has a mountain lodge that needs winter caretakers. He hires the Simpson family. Before they leave, he has Smithers cut off Homer's access to television and beer, the two things Homer requires for baseline psychological stability. This detail is the segment's most important creative addition to the Kubrick source material. In the original film, Jack Torrance's descent into madness is driven by the supernatural evil of the hotel, by his own buried rage and alcoholism, and by the pressure of isolation. In the Simpsons version, Homer's descent is driven by the removal of beer and television. The horror is exactly the same, but the cause has been translated into the specific terms of Homer Simpson's character. The hotel's evil is still present. The ghosts of past caretakers appear, including a prior caretaker played as a direct reference to Kubrick's original. But Homer does not need supernatural assistance to lose his mind. He just needs to go without his comforts for long enough. Homer's turn toward violence follows the original film's rhythm. He begins to hear things. He wanders the empty hotel. He writes, "The original film's most iconic image, Jack Torrance at his typewriter, has been writing 'All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy' across hundreds of pages. A single sentence repeated until it fills a room." In the Simpsons version, Homer's version of this is also a single repeated sentence, but the joke is that it is a sentence about television and beer, the things that were taken from him. The horror of the original image, a man reduced to one obsessive thought, evidence of a mind collapsing, is preserved and repointed at Homer's specific psychology. The moment where Homer pursues Marge through the hotel with an axe is animated as a direct visual reference to Kubrick's film. The hallway chase, the door being broken down, the specific framing of the axe coming through the wood. These images were burned into the cultural memory of anyone who had seen the original film, and the segment reproduced them with enough fidelity to function as genuine reference while shifting the emotional register. Homer doing what Jack Torrance did is funny, because Homer is Homer. The horror is present underneath the comedy, available to anyone who knows the original, but the comedy is what the surface offers. The segment's ending is darker than the film it parodies. In Kubrick's version, the father's madness has stopped. The hotel is destroyed. The surviving family escapes into the winter, and the nightmare ends. In the Simpsons version, groundskeeper Willie saves the family using the Shinning. He reaches Bart telepathically and tells him that television will cure Homer. Bart finds a portable television, Homer watches it, and immediately returns to his normal self. Crisis over. But then the segment ends. The family is shown sitting together in front of the television in the snow, frozen. Literally frozen, stuck in the cold, watching television. Unable to change the channel, unable to move, unable to do anything other than sit and watch. Homer, deprived of the screen again, begins to feel the murderous urge returning. The joke is that the solution and the problem are the same thing. Television saves Homer from madness, and television is also the cage the family is trapped in. The Simpsons end their Halloween story not with escape, but with a different version of the same imprisonment. They are not being chased. They are not in immediate danger. They are just sitting in front of a screen in the cold, and they cannot stop. The axe is still in Homer's hands, metaphorically. He has just found a way to keep it from swinging, for now. This ending is, on examination, one of the most honest things the show ever said about its own relationship with its audience. The Simpsons runs on television. The family's stability runs on television. Homer's sanity in this segment literally depends on a screen being in front of his face. The horror of the shinning is not that Homer goes mad. The horror is that the thing that restores him also traps him, and the family, and that the restoration and the trap are identical. Bob Cushel, who wrote the segment, had been deeply influenced by Kubrick. The director of The Shining was, Cushel later noted, one of the main reasons he had wanted to work in film and television. There is something interesting in that. A writer who was inspired by a filmmaker creating a parody of that filmmaker's work, motivated not by mockery, but by admiration. The Shining is not making fun of Kubrick, it is paying attention to Kubrick, taking the images and the structure seriously enough to reproduce them accurately, and then asking what happens when Homer Simpson is placed inside them. Matt Groening, in the DVD commentary for the episode, admitted that he had not actually seen The Shining. Most of the references were entirely lost on him. This created an interesting production dynamic, a segment deeply invested in its source material being made in a writer's room where the creator of the show had no personal relationship with that source material. The writers who knew the film had to make a segment that also worked for the show's creator, who was encountering it cold. The result is a parody that functions on two levels simultaneously. For people who know Kubrick's film, the segment is a precise and loving recreation. For people who have no knowledge of the original, it is still a story about Homer going crazy in a snowbound lodge because he cannot watch television, which is funny and unsettling on its own terms. The Shining consistently ranks at the top of fan polls for the best Treehouse of Horror segment ever made. The consensus holds across different generations of Simpsons viewers, different levels of familiarity with the source material, different relationships with the show. People who grew up with the show in the 90s and people who discovered it later both land in the same place. The segment works. It has always worked. It will probably always work. Part of what makes it work is the specific seriousness with which it treats its own comedy. The Shining is not a segment that keeps winking at the audience. It commits to the horror frame completely, reproduces the Kubrick imagery with genuine craft, and trusts that the comedy will emerge from the collision between that commitment and the characters inside it. Homer being genuinely threatening with an axe is funny because Homer is Homer. The fact that it is also a little bit disturbing, that the sequence does generate actual unease before the joke lands, is not a problem. It is the point. The best Treehouse of Horror moments are the ones where the comedy and the horror are not taking turns, but happening at the same time, in the same frame, and the audience is genuinely not sure which feeling is winning. The Shining gives the audience that feeling for almost its entire runtime. And then it gives them a family, frozen in front of a television in the snow, and Homer's hands beginning to twitch, and the credits roll. The Simpsons had done something remarkable. Original, the greatest parody of one of the greatest horror films ever made, produced by a writer's room for a cartoon series, landing with enough force to be the defining version of that story for an entire generation of people who had never seen Kubrick's original. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That is what was at the front of Treehouse of Horror 5. What was at the back was the darkest, bloodiest, most genuinely disturbing segment the show had ever produced. And it was written by someone who had never written a Simpsons episode before, who found his inspiration not in a famous horror film, but in a radio show that had scared him as a child, and who created something so raw and so honest about what institutions do to children that it has never fully left the people who saw it. Section 6. Nightmare Cafeteria. David X. Cohen had never written a Simpsons script before. He was a new staff writer in the Season 6 writer's room, brought in during the period when the show was at the absolute height of its creative power. The room he walked into contained some of the best comedy writers working in American television at the time. The standard was extraordinarily high, and for his first assignment, his very first piece of writing for the show, Cohen was handed the final segment of Treehouse of Horror 5 and told to fill it. What he produced was Nightmare Cafeteria, and it scared him to make it. The inspiration did not come from a horror film or a novel or a piece of famous literature. Cohen had grown up listening to a radio program called Lights Out, an old American radio show that ran from the 1930s through the 1950s and specialized in horror stories designed specifically for audio, stories that relied on sound and imagination rather than images. One particular episode of that program, called The Dark, had stayed with Cohen since childhood. It scared him in a specific way that he had never fully let go of. When he sat down to write Nightmare Cafeteria, that old radio fear was what he reached for. The segment also had a specific connection to an earlier regular Simpsons episode, not a Halloween special, but a canon episode from Season 3 called Bart the Murderer. In that episode, Principal Skinner goes missing, and one of the rumors that spreads around Springfield Elementary is that Skinner was ground into hamburger meat and served in the cafeteria. It was a throwaway joke in that episode, a dark, absurdist detail that the show moved past immediately. Cohen's segment took that throwaway joke and made it the entire premise. The setup is institutional rather than supernatural. Springfield Elementary is overcrowded. The cafeteria is underfunded. The detention room is full. Principal Skinner, facing a budget that cannot accommodate the number of students in his care, lands on a solution during a moment that begins as an accident. A student named Jimbo Jones spills soup on himself in the cafeteria and lands in a cooking pot. Lunch Lady Doris tastes the resulting liquid and finds it surprisingly good. Skinner, watching, makes a calculation. The school has a food shortage and a student surplus. The solution presents itself. The next day, Sloppy Jimbo is on the menu. From there, the segment moves with a cold, almost bureaucratic logic. Skinner begins sending students to detention for increasingly minor offenses, and the students sent to detention do not come back. A student named Uter, a German exchange student who appeared occasionally in regular Simpsons episodes, is sent to detention and turned into a dish the teachers call Utebraten. The name is a direct German food reference, and the cheerfulness of the wordplay sits in grotesque contrast to what it describes. The teachers evolve as the segment progresses. By the midpoint, Edna Krabappel has grown visibly larger from eating so many students. The teachers move through the halls with a predatory confidence they did not have at the start. They have stopped pretending the situation is normal. They are sending children to detention for things that could not possibly be the children's fault, things that happen to them rather than things they choose to do. The rules of the institution have been completely abandoned, but the forms of the institution remain. Students are still sent to detention through the official process. The paperwork paperwork is still being filed, presumably. The structure of school authority is intact. Only the purpose of that structure has changed. This is what makes Nightmare Cafeteria genuinely disturbing in a way that goes beyond its surface horror. The violence in the segment is not random. It operates through systems. Skinner does not chase children through hallways with a weapon. He sends them to detention. He fills out whatever form needs to be filled out. He uses the machinery of school administration to route children towards slaughter. The horror wears the clothes of normal institutional life. And this is far more frightening than any monster could be. Bart and Lisa figure out what is happening relatively early in the segment. They go to Marge for help. Marge's response is the segment's funniest and most disturbing moment. She gives them advice, practical advice. She tells them to look the teacher straight in the eye and say, "Don't eat me." This is treated as useful guidance. Marge is not in denial about the situation. She understands that the teachers are killing and eating children. She simply responds to it the way she responds to most problems, with patient, practical, slightly insufficient counsel. The joke depends on the gap between the horror of the situation and the normalcy of the response. The horror is that the gap is not very wide. Homer also had a scene in early drafts of the segment. According to the production record, there was originally a moment where Homer tells Lisa about his dream of eating Milhouse. This scene was cut. The decision to remove it was most likely a tonal one. Homer casually fantasizing about eating his son's best friend would have pushed the comedy of the segment in a direction that undercut the genuine darkness Cohen was going for. The segment works because the adults who are not participating in the eating are responding with mild concern rather than horror. Adding Homer's dream would have made the adult world uniformly monstrous, and the segment is more unsettling when the monstrousness is specific and institutional rather than universal. Two other scenes were cut involving Sherry and Terry, the twin girls who appear regularly in the background of Springfield Elementary. They were to have been cooked as a dish called teriyaki steak with sherry sauce. The wordplay was clearly there and clearly deliberate, but these scenes did not make the final cut either. Sherry can actually be spotted still alive in the background of the segment's later scenes, in the pen where the remaining unchosen students are kept. The cut scenes left their trace in the finished product. The pen of remaining students is one of the segment's most carefully constructed images. The children who have not yet been taken to detention are kept in what the segment calls a free-range area, an open enclosure with a low fence that any of them could step over without difficulty. None of them try. They wander in small circles, not speaking, not looking at each other, not attempting to leave. The fence is meaningless as a physical barrier. What keeps them inside it is something else. The years of conditioning that tell them not to step outside the boundaries the school has set, not to break the rules, not to leave without permission. The institution has trained them so thoroughly to stay within its lines that the lines hold even when the institution has turned against them. This image is the darkest thing in a very dark segment, and it does not involve any blood or any violence. It is just children standing in a pen they could walk out of, staying inside because they have been taught to. Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse are the last students not in detention. They decide to escape. Skinner and the teachers corner them on a ledge above a giant industrial blender. The blender is caked in blood. Groundskeeper Willie appears and attempts to save them. Skinner kills him with an axe to the back, the third instance of the running gag, the third death of the episode's consistent sacrificial figure. Willie's final words after the axe lands are, "Oh, I'm bad at this." The helplessness of it is funny and bleak simultaneously. Willie keeps trying to help and keeps dying for it, and his last statement is a resigned admission that the helping is not going well. Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse fall toward the blender. Then Bart wakes up. The segment has been a nightmare. The horror was a dream, and the show pulls the audience back from the edge with the oldest horror story trick available. Everything is fine. Nothing happened. Bart is in bed. It was not real. But the fog rolls in. An unexplained mist arrives and turns the entire Simpson family inside out. Their internal organs become their external surface. Their insides become their outsides. This transformation is shown with a level of visual detail that the show's animation department clearly committed to fully. The inside-out family is drawn with specificity, the colors and shapes of what is normally hidden made visible. Then the family, inside out, begins to sing and dance. It is a musical number. Everyone is cheerful, and also Inside Out Willie joins them. The episode ends with the Inside Out family performing a song while Santa's little helper drags Bart away by his intestine. Cohen wrote this final sequence specifically to end on something lighter after the darkness of the main segment. The Inside Out transformation was inspired directly by the radio program The Dark, the episode that had frightened him as a child. The dance number was added deliberately as a counterweight, a way of releasing the tension the segment had built and sending the audience to the credits with something absurd rather than something bleak. The episode as a whole, and Nightmare Cafeteria specifically, drew significant attention for the level of violence and disturbing content it contained, more than any previous Treehouse of Horror. This was the intended outcome, given showrunner David Merkin's deliberate decision to push the violence further in response to complaints. The complaints had argued the show was too violent. Merkin's answer was to make the Halloween special more violent, more graphic, and more genuinely upsetting, but to do it in a context where the horror frame justified it. The Treehouse of Horror existed as a space where different rules applied. Merkin was claiming that space fully. Nightmare Cafeteria is the most sustained piece of institutional horror the show ever produced. The cafeteria, the detention room, the teacher's lounge, the principal's office, all of the familiar architecture of elementary school is present and functioning. The horror does not replace the institution. It grows from inside it, uses its systems, wears its authority. Students are consumed through proper channels. Forms are filled out. Procedures are followed. The institution eats its children with paperwork. For the generation of people who were children in elementary school when this episode aired, watching it at an age when Skinner and Krabappel were actual authority figures in their lives, the segment landed differently than it does for adult viewers watching it for the first time. The teachers were not abstractions. The cafeteria was not a generic setting. The procedural machinery of the segment, the sending to detention, the official language, the calm authority with which the eating was organized, mapped directly onto a world the audience was living inside every weekday. Cohen's first Simpsons script was an argument about what school does to children, dressed up in the language of horror, built from an old radio broadcast that had scared him as a boy. The argument was that the systems adults build to manage children are not inherently protective, that authority and predation can occupy the same role without contradiction, that the fence keeping you safe and the fence keeping you in are sometimes the same fence, and the people you trust to protect you are sometimes the people you most need protecting from. That is a difficult argument to make in a primetime animated comedy. Cohen made it in his first attempt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The very next year, the show would attempt something that had never been done on American television before. Something that required bringing in an entirely separate company to pull off. Cost what that company later described as almost nothing because they wanted the credit so badly, and aired just 1 month before a film that would go on to be considered one of the most important moments in animation history. The show put Homer Simpson into a dimension he had no business being in, and the result was 10 minutes of television that still looks unlike anything else the Treehouse of Horror ever produced. Section 7, Homer Cubed, the 3D Dimension. October 29th, 1995, Season 7. The show was about
about to do something it had never done before, something American television had never done before.
And it was going to do it in the third segment of a Halloween special, the slot traditionally reserved for the least consequential story of the night, the one the audience was already slightly tired by the time it arrived. Treehouse of Horror 6 aired that Sunday evening. It contained 3 segments. The first, Attack of the 50-Foot Eyesores, was written by John Swartzwelder and featured giant advertising mascots coming to life and destroying Springfield. The second, Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace, was written by Steve Tompkins and placed Groundskeeper Willie as a dream-invading killer in direct parody of Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Both were strong segments, well constructed, true to the Treehouse tradition. Neither of them is what anyone remembers about Treehouse of Horror 6. What everyone remembers is Homer 3. The segment was written by David X. Cohen, the same writer who had produced Nightmare Cafeteria the previous year in his first Simpsons script. This was his second Halloween assignment. The 2 segments could not be more different from each other. Where Nightmare Cafeteria was grounded, institutional, and built from slow dread, Homer 3 was conceptual, visually experimental, and built from a single audacious idea about geometry. The idea came from executive producer Bill Oakley. The writer's room kept a book about the Twilight Zone on the shelves, a reference book covering the episodes of Rod Serling's classic anthology series. Oakley was flipping through it one day and landed on a description of an episode called Little Girl Lost, which aired in 1962. In that episode, a young girl falls through a dimensional portal and becomes trapped in a 4th dimension, a space that exists alongside the normal world but cannot be seen or entered by the people trying to reach her. Her parents and a physicist work to retrieve her before the portal closes permanently. Oakley's thought was immediate and specific. Why doesn't Homer get stuck in the 3rd dimension? The logic worked on multiple levels. The Twilight Zone episode involved a character being pulled into a dimension more complex than the one they normally inhabited. Homer Simpson normally inhabits a 2-dimensional animated world. Pulling him into a 3-dimensional space would be, for Homer, exactly the kind of disorienting dimensional displacement the Twilight Zone episode described. The joke was structural and visual simultaneously. Homer trapped in 3D is Homer made strange, made solid, made somehow more real, and therefore more wrong. The original concept was more ambitious than what aired. The initial plan involved Homer traveling through multiple dimensions, each one rendered in a different visual style. One dimension would have been made of paper cutouts. Another would have been claymation. The idea was a tour through different ways of making animation, with Homer as the bewildered traveler encountering each one. This version was abandoned because it was going to cost too much and take too long. The decision was made to focus entirely on the 3-dimensional world and to parody the Twilight Zone episode as faithfully as possible, the same approach that had made The Shining work the year before. For the 3-dimensional animation, the production turned to a company called Pacific Data Images, known as PDI. PDI was an American computer animation company that would later be bought by DreamWorks and go on to produce the Shrek films, the Kung Fu Panda films, and the Madagascar films. In 1995, PDI was looking for opportunities to demonstrate what computer animation could do. They approached The Simpsons production and offered to do the work for almost nothing, far below what the going rate for computer animation would have been at the time. They wanted the credit. They wanted the audience. They wanted the world to see what their technology was capable of. The Simpsons production accepted. Supervising director David Silverman was clear about the standard he was aiming for. He wanted the computer animation in Homer Cubed to be better than the animation in the music video for Money for Nothing by Dire Straits, a famous 1985 music video that had been one of the most widely seen examples of computer animation up to that point. The Dire Straits video was blocky and primitive by later standards, but it had been genuinely impressive for its time. Silverman wanted to clear that bar comfortably. The PDI animators worked in close coordination with the regular Simpsons animation team. The Simpsons animators storyboarded the Homer Cube segment in their normal style, drawing the sequences the way they would have handled them in traditional two-dimensional animation. Then they handed those storyboards to the PDI team and showed them how the characters would move, how Homer and Bart carried themselves, how their gestures worked. The PDI animators studied these boards and tried to translate the specific physical language of the Simpsons characters into 3 dimensions without losing what made those characters recognizable. One specific problem took significant time to solve. Nobody knew how to render Bart's hair in 3 dimensions. Bart's hair in 2-dimensional animation is a crown of 9 sharp spikes arranged around his head, an image that works because it is a stylized graphic representation rather than a realistic depiction of how hair behaves. In 3 dimensions, that same shape would look strange and wrong. The solution came from an unexpected source. The production team realized that vinyl Bart Simpson dolls had been manufactured and were widely available. These dolls had already solved the problem of representing Bart's hair as a 3-dimensional object. The animators purchased one and used it as their reference model. Making Homer and Bart move without looking robotic was described by the PDI team as one of the most difficult parts of the entire project. Computer animation in 1995 had a tendency to make characters move with a mechanical precision that human beings do not actually possess. The movements were too smooth, too even, without the slight imperfections and variations that make motion feel organic. Homer and Bart, in 2-dimensional animation, have a looseness and imprecision to their movement that is part of what makes them feel alive. Translating that looseness into computer animation required deliberate effort and significant time. The segment itself opens in the normal 2-dimensional Simpsons world. Homer is hiding from Marge's sisters, Patty and Selma, who are visiting and whose presence Homer has always found unbearable. He ducks into a bookshelf, looking for somewhere to hide, and discovers a portal, a shimmering, geometric opening into a space that is clearly different from anything in the regular Simpsons universe. Homer falls through it and finds himself in the 3-dimensional world. His response to arriving in this new dimension is immediately and perfectly Homer. He looks around at the landscape of geometric shapes and mathematical formulas floating in digital space. He observes that it looks expensive. He notes that nobody seems to be around. He tries to figure out how to get home. He accidentally steps on a cone, creating a crack in the dimensional fabric that begins expanding and threatening to consume the entire space. Homer's capacity for accidental destruction, so well established across 6 seasons of regular episodes, transfers seamlessly into a completely new visual environment. The 3-dimensional world Homer inhabits is filled with background details that the writing staff put significant effort into. The landscape contains genuine mathematical references, jokes embedded in the environment for viewers who would recognize them. One formula visible in the background states that P equals NP, which is one of the most famous unsolved problems in mathematics. Another shows a numerical equation that, if true, would disprove Fermat's last theorem, a mathematical problem that had been famously solved just the year before, in 1994. The equation appears true if you check it on a basic calculator, but it is actually false. Cohen, who had a background in computer science and mathematics before becoming a television writer, wrote a computer program specifically to generate this equation. The show was hiding a sophisticated mathematical prank in the background of a Halloween cartoon. A sequence of numbers, visible when Homer first enters the dimension, reads, in ASCII code, the system computers use to represent letters as numbers, Frink rules. This was a hidden message from the writers, a tribute to Professor Frink, the show's show's recurring scientist character. When Homer tries to explain the three-dimensional world to the people back in the regular dimension, who can see him but cannot enter his space, he searches for a reference point. He asks if anyone saw the movie Tron. Nobody responds enthusiastically. The reference is accurate. Tron, the 1982 Disney science fiction film, depicted a digital world visually similar to the space Homer now occupies. But the joke is that Homer's cultural touchstones are always slightly wrong for the situation, always the second best reference rather than the most precise one. The segment aired on October 29, 1995. Toy Story, the Pixar film widely considered the first feature-length entirely computer-animated film, opened in American theaters on November 22, 1995, less than 4 weeks later. Homer 3 predated it. The Simpsons put three-dimensional computer animation into American living rooms before Pixar put it into movie theaters. This fact tends to get lost in the history of computer animation because Homer 3 was a segment within a television episode rather than a theatrical release, and because Toy Story was a vastly larger and more sustained piece of work. The Simpsons did not beat Pixar in any meaningful competitive sense. What is true is that PDI, the company that animated Homer 3, put their work on American television screens before Pixar's landmark film arrived, and they did it as a calling card to demonstrate what the technology could accomplish. The same PDI would later become PDI DreamWorks, part of the studio that made Shrek. The animation company that worked for almost nothing to put Homer Simpson in 3 dimensions went on to produce some of the most commercially successful animated films ever made. The final scene of the segment is the show's first ever live-action sequence. Homer, after the three-dimensional world collapses around him, is pushed through into the real world, not back to Springfield, not back to animation, but into actual filmed reality. The camera shows a real Los Angeles street at night. Homer, rendered in 3 dimensions, stands on it looking around. He is bewildered, but not panicked. He spots an adult novelty bakery called the Erotic Cake Company and walks toward it with interest. This is where the segment ends. Homer, displaced from his home dimension, having survived the collapse of a mathematical universe, immediately drawn toward cake. The live-action footage featured real people. Dennis Bailey, Ron Brooks, Trish Doolin, and Marcia Waterbury appeared as pedestrians in the real-world sequence, credited in the episode's closing credits. These were the only live-action performers ever to appear in a Treehouse of Horror episode in the show's history up to that point. The episode in its original broadcast was watched by 22.9 million viewers, achieving a Nielsen rating of 12.9, and finishing 21st in the weekly ratings. It was the highest-rated show on the Fox network the week it aired. Homer 3 also had a second life beyond its original broadcast. An edited version of the segment was included in a 2000 theatrical film called Cyberworld, an anthology of computer animation shorts shown in IMAX theaters and IMAX 3D theaters. Homer Simpson, in 3 dimensions, appeared on enormous IMAX screens alongside other examples of what computer animation had achieved by the turn of the millennium. Bill Oakley, the producer who pitched the original concept, described the moment Homer steps through the portal into the 3-dimensional world as the money shot of the episode, the single image the entire segment was built to deliver. Homer, a flat yellow cartoon man, stepping from his flat cartoon world into solid geometric space, turning to look back at the 2-dimensional reality he has just left. The image works because the contrast is so complete. 2-dimensional Homer and 3-dimensional Homer exist in the same frame for a moment, and the difference between them is enormous. Homer looks more solid, more real, and somehow more wrong than he has ever looked before. That wrongness is the horror in Homer 3. Not a monster, not a murderer, not a supernatural threat. The horror is seeing something familiar made unfamiliar. Seeing a character you know rendered in a way that makes him look like he does not belong in his own body. Homer in three dimensions is Homer and not Homer simultaneously. He moves with Homer's gestures and speaks with Homer's voice, but he casts shadows and has mass and occupies space in a way that Homer has never occupied space before. He is uncanny in the truest sense, something known made strange enough to disturb. The segment understood intuitively that the most effective horror does not always come from external threats. Sometimes it comes from looking at something familiar and seeing it wrong.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 1 year after Homer stepped into a dimension made of mathematics and shadows, Kang and Kodos, the drooling, one-eyed aliens who had been quietly appearing in every Halloween episode since 1990, finally got the spotlight all to themselves. And the target they chose was not a single family, not a single town, but the entire American democratic system. The resulting segment became one of the most quoted pieces of political comedy the show ever produced, and it has gotten more accurate with every election cycle that has passed since. Section 8, Citizen Kang, October 27th, 1996, 4 days before Halloween, 5 days before the United States presidential election. The timing was not accidental. Treehouse of Horror 7 was the first episode of Season 8 of The Simpsons,
which was itself a statement about how the show treated its Halloween special. Most programs buried their holiday episodes in the middle of a season. The Simpsons opened its 8th year with one. The episode contained 3 segments. The Thing and I, written by Ken Keeler, The Genesis Tub, written by Dan Greeny, and Citizen Kang, written by David X. Cohen. It was directed by Mike B. Anderson. The episode aired on October 27, 1996. Bill Clinton was the sitting president of the United States, running for re-election against Republican challenger Bob Dole. The election was 5 days away. Every voter in America was days from making a decision about who would lead the country for the next 4 years. The Simpsons chose this exact moment to air a segment in which both candidates were kidnapped by one-eyed drooling aliens and replaced with imposters. And the country elected one of the aliens anyway. Phil Hartman voiced Bill Clinton in the segment. Hartman was one of the most frequent and beloved guest performers in Simpsons history, best known within the show for his recurring role as the lawyer Lionel Hutz and the actor Troy McClure. His Clinton was warm and slightly slick, the voice of a man who was always performing even when he appeared to be relaxed. Hartman had been doing Clinton impressions in other contexts as well, and his familiarity with the character's rhythms gave the performance an ease that made it immediately recognizable. Kang voiced Bob Dole, and Kodos voiced Bill Clinton. Harry Shearer played Kang, Dan Castellaneta played Kodos. Both performers delivered their lines with the broad theatrical seriousness that had defined Kang and Kodos since their introduction 6 years earlier. Deep voices, formal cadence, the slight wrongness of creatures who have studied human behavior from a distance and are now attempting to reproduce it in real time. The segment begins with Homer fishing alone in a lake. Kang and Kodos abduct him, bringing him aboard their ship. This is standard operating procedure for the two aliens. They have been appearing in every Treehouse of Horror since 1990, usually with plans to conquer or consume the Earth in some form. Homer, who has been abducted by these particular aliens before, takes the situation with his characteristic lack of alarm. He is more curious than frightened. Kang and Kodos explain that they want to be taken to Earth's leader. Homer explains that Earth does not have a single leader. It has countries, and each country has its own leadership. And in the United States, the leader is chosen by popular election from a field of candidates. He describes the 1996 presidential presidential race. He names Clinton and Dole. The aliens listen, process this information, and arrive at their plan. They will kidnap both candidates and replace them with themselves. Whichever candidate wins the election, an alien will be running the country. The plan accounts for all possible outcomes. It is, within the terms of the segment's logic, completely airtight. Homer is returned to Earth with a warning not to tell anyone what he saw. He immediately tells everyone he sees. This is also consistent with Homer's character. He cannot keep information contained, not because he is malicious, but because the gap between what he knows and what he says is essentially non-existent in him. Kang and Kodos, now impersonating Clinton and Dole, begin campaigning. The segment shows them at a press conference. Kang, as Dole, delivers a speech. The speech is a perfect compression of how political language works, the way candidates respond to every question by pivoting to something that sounds like an answer but contains nothing specific, the way applause is generated through rhythm and delivery rather than content. Kang, as Dole, announces that he is in favor of all abortions. The crowd boos. He reverses immediately. No abortions for anyone. The crowd boos again. He pauses, calculates, and offers abortions for some and miniature American flags for others. The crowd cheers. They wave the flags. The position is completely incoherent. The crowd does not care about the position. They responded to the cadence, to the gesture, to the flag, the physical prop that signals patriotism without requiring any particular thought about what patriotism means or demands. This is the segment's central argument, and it is delivered in about 15 seconds of screen time with enough precision that it has been quoted in discussions about American political behavior for nearly 30 years since it aired. Kent Brockman, Springfield's news anchor, covers the campaign. His line summarizing the electoral situation has become almost as famous as the abortion speech. He describes the choice facing American voters as Campaign 96, America Flips a Coin. The image of democracy as a coin flip, two options, arbitrary selection, outcome determined by chance rather than meaningful preference, is delivered by Brockman with his standard professional gravity, as though reporting sports scores. The joke is that the news treats this observation as analysis, rather than as the devastating critique of the entire system that it actually is. Homer eventually figures out that the candidates are aliens. He exposes them at a public event, pulling off their human disguises to reveal Kang and Kodos in their natural forms, drooling, tentacled, enormous, and completely unapologetic. The crowd reacts with horror. Here is the moment in a story about democratic failure where the audience might expect the system to correct itself. The truth has been revealed. The imposters have been exposed. Surely now the people will make a different choice. Kang, still campaigning, makes the argument that ends the segment's political debate. He points out that there are only two candidates on the ballot. If the voters do not choose him, they will have to choose a third-party candidate. He says the name Ross Perot with maximum contempt. This reference was current. Perot had run as an independent candidate in 1992 and had run again in 1996 under the Reform Party, receiving a small fraction of his earlier support. The joke was that the binary nature of the American electoral system was so deeply embedded that even the revelation of alien imposters could not break it. The crowd considers its options. Then they vote for Kang. Kang wins the election. He takes office. He immediately enslaves the human race, forcing everyone to work on giant construction projects while wearing rags and being driven by alien overseers. The segment's final scene shows a group of enslaved humans walking in a line, doing forced labor. Homer is among them. A man near Homer complains that they should have voted for the other one. Homer's response, that he threw his vote away, refers to the third-party option that the crowd rejected expected when given the chance. This ending has two things happening at the same time. The surface joke is that the aliens enslaved humanity and everyone regrets their vote, which is straightforward enough. The deeper joke is Homer's line about throwing his vote away, the exact phrase that is used in American political culture to discourage people from voting for third-party candidates. The show is pointing at the circular logic that keeps the two-party system in place. Voting for a third party is framed as throwing your vote away, which ensures that almost nobody votes for a third party, which ensures that only two parties remain viable, which ensures that voting for a third party is indeed throwing your vote away. The system maintains itself through the argument that the system cannot be changed. Kang and Kodos have been, in every Treehouse of Horror episode since 1990, a background presence. Creatures who appear for a moment, make a menacing observation or attempt a plan that does not work, and retreat. Citizen Kang was the first and most substantial segment in which they were given the entire story. The segment was written by David X. Cohen, who had now written the two most celebrated segments in the show's recent Halloween history, this one and Nightmare Cafeteria the year before. The title, Citizen Kang, is a reference to the 1941 Orson Welles film Citizen Kane, widely considered one of the greatest films ever made. The film told the story of a powerful man's rise and the people who tried to understand him after his death. The Simpsons segment has almost nothing to do with the film. The title is acknowledged in the episode itself to be essentially just a pun on Kang's name. The joke is that the reference sounds significant and turns out to be purely decorative, which is itself a joke about how political campaigns use the appearance of substance to substitute for the actual thing. The segment aired on October 27, 1996. Bill Clinton won the actual election on November 5th, defeating Bob Dole by a significant margin. Ross Perot received approximately 8% of the vote, down from the 19% he had received in 1992. The segment's observation about the impossibility of third-party success in American politics was confirmed within days of its broadcast. What makes Citizen Kang hold up across decades is that it is not specifically about the 1996 election. The 1996 election is the costume the segment wears. Underneath the costume is an argument about how democratic systems can fail, not through corruption or fraud, but through the voters themselves, through the entirely rational decision to choose the lesser of two available evils rather than risk the uncertainty of anything different. Kang and Kodos do not hack the election. They do not suppress votes. They do not use any power that the electoral system does not give them. They simply get on the ballot, stay on the ballot, and let the system do the rest. The system delivers them the world. The segment has been referenced, quoted, and cited in the years since 1996 with increasing frequency. Every election cycle brings new audiences to the abortion speech and the coin flip line. The specific candidates change. The observation the segment makes does not change. Kang and Kodos remain as accurate a portrait of American electoral politics as any comedy has produced, and they accomplish this in about 8 minutes of Halloween television, in a segment that was sandwiched between a story about Bart's secret twin and a story about Lisa growing a miniature civilization in a science experiment. Groundskeeper Willie appears in the episode's couch gag. The Grim Reaper is sitting on the couch when the family runs in, and they each drop dead one by one before the Reaper puts his feet up on their bodies. Willie does not die in Citizen Kang specifically. His role in this episode's Treehouse tradition is confined to the couch gag framing rather than the segment itself. This is one of the few Treehouse of Horror episodes where the Willie death gag does not appear inside a main segment, though his presence is still felt in the surrounding material. The episode itself was the first of Season 8, airing before any other episode of that season. Placing the Halloween special as the season premiere was a specific specific decision. It established the show's confidence in the Treehouse of Horror tradition as a piece of television strong enough to open an entire season, strong enough to be the first thing a returning audience saw after the summer break. By 1996, the Treehouse of Horror had been running for 6 years. It had introduced Kang and Kodos, adapted Edgar Allan Poe, parodied The Shining, sent Homer to hell and back, put children into a cafeteria blender, pushed Homer into a computer-animated dimension, and now put alien imposters in the White House. Each year had been different. Each year had found a new angle, a new set of reference points, a new thing the horror frame could accommodate that the regular show could not. Citizen Kang completed something that the earlier segments had started. The Treehouse of Horror was not just a place for horror film parodies and dark comedy about mortality. It was a space where the show could say things about the real world, about politics, about power, about the systems that govern people's lives, with a directness that the regular episodes, bound by the rules of continuity and character, could not always manage. Kang and Kodos winning an election by enslaving the human race is funny. It is also an argument. The argument is that the willingness to accept only the choices already on offer, to stay inside the fence even when the fence is low enough to step over, is what makes certain outcomes inevitable. The children standing in the free-range pen in Nightmare Cafeteria, the family frozen in front of a television in the snow, the crowd cheering for miniature American flags. These images are about the same thing. They are about the way people stay inside systems that are not serving them because the alternative is the uncertainty of stepping outside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show built 9 specific cases across its Halloween tradition that tell one continuous story about horror, about comedy, about what animation is capable of, and what television is allowed to say. The final 2 cases in that tradition cover ground the earlier ones could not, a death that happens in every segment, in every story, without fail, the most reliable sacrifice in the show's entire history, and what that recurring death is actually saying about the kind of people who always get hurt first. And then the show's most recent landmark, a Japanese animation style, a magic notebook, and Lisa Simpson finally given the power she has always deserved and never been allowed to use. Section 9. The Shinning's Hidden Running Gag, Groundskeeper Willie's Deaths. There is a character in The Simpsons who dies more than any other. He dies in Halloween episodes specifically, and he dies the same way every time, and he always dies while trying to help someone. He never survives. His attempts to intervene never succeed. The help he offers is always genuine, always timely, and always fatal to himself. He is not the main character in any of the segments where he dies. He is not even a supporting character in most of them. He is a recurring figure who appears at the edge of the story, reaches towards someone who needs reaching, and then receives an axe in the back for his trouble. His name is Groundskeeper Willie, and his deaths across the Treehouse of Horror series are one of the most carefully constructed running jokes in the show's entire history. Willie first appeared in the regular Simpsons series as the groundskeeper of Springfield Elementary, a large, aggressive Scottish man with an enormous red beard and a personality that swings between barely contained fury and surprising warmth toward the students in his care. He maintains the school's outdoor spaces. He drives the riding lawnmower. He shouts. He is, in the regular episodes, a background character who gets more to do than most background characters because the writers found his specific combination of roughness and genuine feeling useful. He is not gentle, but he cares. He is not articulate, but he means what he says. He is the kind of person who will pick up a child who has fallen before anyone else has noticed they went down. This quality, the willingness to act, to step in, to try, is what makes him the Treehouse of Horror's most consistent victim. The running gag of Willie dying in every segment of Treehouse of Horror 5 was introduced in the 1994 episode and was deliberate from the start. The writers needed something to tie three completely separate stories together. The Shinning, Time and Punishment, and Nightmare Cafeteria had no shared characters, no shared setting, no shared plot logic. They were three different horror parodies in three different genres. The connecting thread the writers chose was Willie. Specifically, Willie getting an axe in the back in each segment while attempting to help someone. In The Shining, Willie discovers that Bart has the psychic ability the segment calls the Shining. He reaches out to Bart telepathically to warn him, to offer guidance, to tell him that this ability can be used to save the family from Homer's madness. Willie is functioning as the equivalent of Dick Hallorann in the original Shining film, the character who recognizes the child's gift and attempts to come to his aid. In Kubrick's film, Dick Hallorann travels through a blizzard to reach the Overlook Hotel and is immediately murdered by Jack Torrance when he arrives. In the Simpsons version, Willie suffers the same fate for the same reason. He tries to help. He is killed before he can. The axe finds his back. His last words in that segment, delivered after the axe has already landed, are a calm and mildly irritated acknowledgement of the situation. He does not scream. He does not make a speech. He notes what has happened with the weary resignation of someone who is not entirely surprised that their attempt to assist has ended this way. In Time and Punishment, the middle segment of Treehouse of Horror 5, in which Homer accidentally turns his toaster into a time machine and keeps landing in prehistoric eras and changing the future, Willie appears in an alternate timeline. Homer's repeated trips through time keep producing different versions of Springfield, some better than his original home, and some dramatically worse. In one version of the future, Willie materializes and tries to help Homer figure out what has gone wrong. The axe arrives before the help can be completed. Willie, in this timeline, may not be the same Willie as the one in the main story. The alternate timeline logic of the segment means he could be a version of Willie who has never attempted this particular kind of help before, who has no reason to expect the axe. The outcome is the same regardless. In Nightmare Cafeteria, Willie's death is the most structurally significant of the three. Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse are trapped on a ledge above a giant industrial blender. The teachers are closing in. There is no visible escape. Willie physically arrives, climbing or jumping to their level, with the clear intention of protecting them from Skinner and the other teachers. He is the only adult in the entire segment who acts on behalf of the children rather than against them. He is the only person in the school's employ who has not joined the institutional predation. He is the intervention the segment has been building toward, the rescue that the story seems to require. Skinner kills him immediately. The axe goes in.
Willie's final words in this segment, "Oh, I'm bad at this," are the most complete expression of the gag's full meaning. He is not bad at caring. He is not bad at showing up. He is specifically bad at surviving the act of showing up to help. And he knows it, and he says so, and then he is gone. After Treehouse of Horror 5, the Willie death gag did not disappear. The show returned to it in Treehouse of Horror 6 the following year in the second segment, Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace. This segment was a direct parody of Wes Craven's 1984 film A Nightmare on Elm Street, in which a man named Freddy Krueger haunts and murders teenagers in their dreams, a killer who cannot be fought in the waking world because his power exists only while his victims sleep. In Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace, groundskeeper Willie becomes the dream killer. This is the gag's first major inversion. In the previous three instances, Willie was the helper who got killed. In this segment, Willie is the threat. The backstory the show provides is this.
Willie came to a parent-teacher night at Springfield Elementary to report that the furnace in the school boiler room was broken. The parents, absorbed in their meeting and not wanting to be disturbed, ignored him. He was burned to death in the broken furnace. Now he returns in the dreams of Springfield's children, seeking revenge on the parents who would not listen by attacking their kids while they sleep. The transformation of Willie from victim to predator is careful and specific. It does not contradict the character as established in the regular show or in the previous Treehouse of Horror appearances. Willie in Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace is still motivated by the same quality that gets him killed in the other segments. The desire to be heard, the desire to have his warning taken seriously, the desire for his attempt to help to actually reach the people who need it. In Treehouse of Horror 5, he tries to help and is physically stopped by an axe. In Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace, he tries to warn and is stopped by adults who will not listen. And the consequence of that failure to listen is that he dies. And the consequence of that death is that he returns to punish the people who would not pay attention. The show drew a direct connection between these two versions of the character. Willie killed while helping and Willie killing because his help was refused are the same story told from two different ends. In one version, the institution stops him with violence. In the other version, the institution stops him with indifference, which turns out to be equally fatal and produces a more dangerous outcome. The gag also appears in a modified form in other Treehouse of Horror segments across the series. While the specific 3 times in 1 episode structure from Treehouse of Horror 5 is unique to that installment, Willie continues to serve as a recurring sacrificial or threatening figure in later Halloween episodes. The death gag is the most concentrated version of a larger pattern, Willie as the person whose interventions are systematically prevented by violence or by disregard, regardless of how necessary or well-intentioned those interventions are. The reason the gag works structurally is that Willie's deaths are not random. Each one happens at the precise moment when his help would have been most effective. In The Shinning, he dies before he can complete his warning to Bart. In Time and Punishment, he dies before he can explain the timeline problem to Homer. In Nightmare Cafeteria, he dies at the exact moment the children need rescuing. The axe does not arrive while Willie is resting or while he is doing something unrelated. It arrives while he is in the process of doing something that would have worked. The help is interrupted at its most necessary point, which is what makes each death feel like more than a simple joke. There is a reading of the Willie gag that goes beyond the comedy and into something the show is saying about a specific kind of person. Willie is a working-class laborer. He is the groundskeeper, the person who maintains the physical space of the institution without being part of its decision-making structure. He is not a teacher, not an administrator, not a parent on the school board. He is the man who cuts the grass and fixes the furnace and yells at the sky. In the hierarchy of Springfield Elementary, he is near the bottom. He has no authority. His warnings can be ignored. His help can be interrupted. His presence can be dismissed. And yet, he is the one who keeps trying. He is the one who notices when something is wrong. He is the one who shows up at the parent-teacher night to report the broken furnace. He is the one who reaches out to Bart telepathically when Homer is going mad. He is the one who climbs to the ledge to pull the children away from the blender. The people with authority and resources and decision-making power in these segments are either the threat, like Skinner and the teachers in Nightmare Cafeteria, or they are useless bystanders, like the parents who ignore Willie's warning about the furnace. Willie, with no authority and no resources and no official role in any of the crises he tries to address, is the only one who actually tries to do something. The axe in his back is not just a joke. It is a specific observation about which people are most likely to be hurt when they try to intervene in situations that the powerful have created or allowed. Willie does not have the protection that authority provides. He cannot survive an axe the way a principal or a mayor might, not because they are physically different, but because the story is written so that the institution can absorb and neutralize the people who challenge it. And Willie challenges it every time he shows up to help. In Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace, the show shows what happens when that pattern goes wrong in a different direction. The institution ignores Willie once too often, and the result is not that Willie simply fails to help. The result is that Willie becomes the threat. The indifference of the parents creates the monster that comes for their children. The system that refuses to hear its groundskeeper produces, in the Halloween logic of the show, exactly the terror it could have prevented by listening. This is the joke about Willie taken to its natural conclusion. If you ignore the person trying to warn you often enough, the warning eventually stops coming. What comes instead is the thing he was warning you about. The 3 deaths in Treehouse of Horror 5 and the inversion in Treehouse of Horror 6 and the recurring pattern across the series, all of it adds up to one of the most coherent character arguments the show makes across its Halloween tradition. Willie is not a main character. He is not a hero. He is a groundskeeper with a large beard and a lot of feelings who keeps showing up at the worst moments to do the most necessary things and pays for it every time. The show honors him by making his deaths meaningful, by making them happen at the exact moment when they matter most, by making them the thing the audience can count on across 3 decades of Halloween specials, the one joke that runs underneath all the other jokes, the constant that holds the tradition together even when everything else changes. Across every haunted house and alien invasion and donut deal and 3D dimension and alien president, Willie shows up and tries to help and gets the axe. Every time. Without fail, without complaint. With only the mildest verbal acknowledgement of his own bad luck. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nearly 30 years after Willie first took that axe in the back, the Treehouse of Horror produced something that nobody in the 1994 writer's room could have anticipated. A segment animated in a completely different visual style, drawing from a Japanese manga series, putting a magic death notebook in the hands of the show's most morally serious character, and generating a response from the audience so immediate and so passionate that people began asking if the entire series could be made this way. Lisa Simpson, in A Nightmare, was finally given real power. What she did with it said everything about what the show had always understood about her. Section 10, Death Tome, the anime horror episode. October 30th, 2022, Season 34 of The Simpsons. The show had been on the air for 33 years. It had produced 32 previous Treehouse of Horror episodes. It had parodied Stanley Kubrick and Edgar Allan Poe, and Wes Craven and Rod Serling and Francis Ford Coppola, and the entire American electoral system. It had put Homer in 3 dimensions before Pixar put anything in theaters. It had introduced 2 drooling aliens who showed up every Halloween without fail for 3 decades. It had done things with animation and horror and comedy that nobody had attempted before, and some of which nobody has fully matched since. And then, in its 33rd Halloween special, the show did something it had never done in all those years. It changed what it looked like. Treehouse of Horror 33 contained 3 segments. The first was called The Baddest, a parody of a horror film. The third was a parody of the science fiction television series Westworld. Between them was a segment called Death Tome, and Death Tome was a parody of Death Note, a Japanese manga series created by writer Tsugumi Oba and artist Takeshi Obata that had originally been published in a Japanese magazine called Weekly Shonen Jump between 2003 and 2006. Death Note tells the story of a high high school student named Light Yagami who finds a supernatural notebook that allows him to kill anyone whose name he writes in it, provided he knows their face. A death god called Ryuk dropped the notebook into the human world out of boredom. Light picks it up and begins using it to kill criminals, believing he can create a better world by eliminating evil people one by one. The Simpsons version placed Lisa Simpson in the Light Yagami role. This casting decision is the entire argument of the segment, and it is an extremely precise argument about who Lisa is and what the show has done with her across 33 years of regular episodes. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She plays the saxophone. She is a vegetarian. She cares deeply about the environment, about animals, about social justice, about the truth. She reads at a level far beyond her age. She thinks carefully about ethical questions that the adults around her have stopped thinking about entirely. She is, by any measure, the moral center of the Simpson family, the character whose conscience the show uses to identify where the right position on any given issue actually is. She is also, in the regular show, almost completely powerless. Lisa's arguments go unheard. Her warnings are ignored. She identifies problems clearly and specifically, and the problems continue regardless. She is right about things constantly, and being right changes nothing. Springfield ignores her. Her family loves her and ignores her. The school system contains her and ignores her. The corporations that damage the environment she cares about continue their work without interruption. In 33 seasons of The Simpsons, Lisa Simpson has been the most consistently correct character on the show and has achieved the least change of any character on the show as a result of being correct. Death Tome gave her a notebook. The segment opens with a book falling from the sky, the Death Tome, a direct visual reference to the opening of Death Note, in which Ryuk drops his notebook from the Death God realm into the human world. Lisa finds it. She discovers that anyone whose name she writes in the book will die. A figure resembling Ryuk, the death god from the original manga, a tall, spindly, sharp-toothed creature who exists in both the human and death god realms, appears before her and explains what the book does. Lisa's first target is Mr. Burns. This is not a random choice. Mr. Burns is the owner of the Springfield nuclear power plant, the employer of Homer Simpson, and the single character in the show's universe who most clearly represents the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of someone willing to cause harm with it. In the segment, Burns runs a corporation called GloboWarm, a name that describes its purpose without any ambiguity, which has developed a plan to melt the polar ice caps. This plan would destroy coastal cities, displace millions of people, and cause irreversible environmental damage on a global scale. Burns intends to proceed with it. Lisa writes his name in the Death Tome. The segment then shows Lisa expanding her list. She targets employees of GloboWarm, the people carrying out Burns's plan, the people whose participation makes the destruction possible. Each death is depicted in the show's anime visual style, which is the most immediately striking thing about the segment and the thing that generated the most immediate audience response when it aired. The animation in Death Tome looks nothing like the rest of The Simpsons. The regular show uses a specific visual style that has remained largely consistent since 1989. The yellow skin, the round heads, the simplified features, the flat backgrounds. Death Tome abandons all of it. The characters are drawn with the visual vocabulary of Japanese animation, sharper angles, more detailed expressions, larger and more expressive eyes, dynamic action sequences with the kind of motion and energy that the regular Simpsons style does not attempt. Lisa in Death Tome looks like Lisa, recognizably the same character, the same red dress, the same spiky hair, but rendered in a visual language so different from the regular show that the effect is genuinely striking. The show's production team committed to this visual departure completely. The segment was not trying to approximate anime style. style while remaining recognizably Simpsons in its construction. It was attempting to actually look like a different kind of animation, to function visually as a genuine parody of the specific aesthetic of Death Note and the broader visual tradition it comes from. Sequences in the segment are composed like sequences from the original manga's anime adaptation. Dramatic close-ups on eyes, characters moving through stylized environments, action beats timed differently than the regular show's comedy beats. The audience response when Death Tome aired on October 30th, 2022 was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers took to social media within minutes of the segment ending to express their reaction, and the dominant response was not simply that the segment was good. The response was that the show should make an entire series in this style. Multiple people, in multiple separate posts, asked whether a full anime format Simpsons series could be produced. The gap between the regular show's visual style and what Death Tome looked like was wide enough that seeing the characters in the new style felt like encountering them for the first time, familiar and completely different simultaneously. The Ryuk figure who accompanies Lisa through the segment is rendered in a style that captures the specific visual design of the original character. The long limbs, the sharp teeth, the general impression of something not fully belonging to the world it occupies. Ryuk in Death Note is not evil in the traditional sense. He does not manipulate light toward violence. He drops the notebook and watches what happens because he is curious and bored. He is an observer of human nature, more than a participant in it. The Simpsons version maintains this quality. The Ryuk figure accompanies Lisa, but does not direct her. What she does with the book is her choice. Lisa's killing spree is depicted as a justice spree. She identifies targets based on their participation in environmental destruction. Her logic is internally consistent. These are people causing measurable harm to the planet, harm that the normal channels of protest and argument and democratic participation have failed to stop. Lisa has tried the normal channels. Lisa has been trying the normal channels her entire life. The Notebook offers something the normal channels cannot: results. This is where the segment becomes most honest about who Lisa Simpson is and what the show has always understood about her situation. The horror of Death Tome is not that Lisa kills people. The horror is that her targets are genuinely guilty of the things she is punishing them for. Mr. Burns' plan to melt the polar ice caps is exactly the kind of thing Mr. Burns would do. The employees of GloboWarm are exactly the kind of people who work for exactly this kind of operation. Lisa's moral case is not complicated. She has found a way to stop real harm and she is using it. The show does not allow this to stand uncomplicated. Bart discovers what Lisa is doing by reading her diary, a detail that is perfectly true to both characters. Lisa keeps a diary because she processes the world through writing. Bart invades her privacy because he is Bart. He finds out about the justice spree and confronts her. The segment shows Lisa at the point of writing Bart's name in the Death Tome, the moment when the logic of the Notebook's power, taken to its conclusion, would turn against someone she loves. She stops. She recognizes what she has become. She realizes that the power has changed her, that the willingness to decide who deserves to die has expanded from the clearly guilty toward the merely inconvenient, and that the next step is her own brother. She puts the book down. This ending mirrors the original Death Note's central argument fairly closely. In the manga, Light Yagami begins with a genuine desire to eliminate evil, and ends up eliminating anyone who threatens his power, including people whose only crime is investigating him. The Notebook does not corrupt Light because he is weak. It reveals what he was always capable of under the right conditions. The Simpsons version compresses this arc into the length strength of a Treehouse of Horror segment and applies it to Lisa, the show's most consistently ethical character. The argument is that the Notebook does not change who you are. It changes what you can do, and what you can do changes what you are willing to do, and what you are willing to do eventually stops being recognizable as yourself. Lisa stopping before she writes Bart's name is the segment's version of a happy ending, and it is also the segment's saddest moment. She stops because she loves Bart. She does not stop because Burns was innocent or because her targets did not deserve what happened to them. She stops because the next name on the list belongs to someone she cannot lose. The love is real, and it saves her. But the environmental destruction she was trying to stop is also still real and still happening, and will continue happening now that the Notebook has been put away. The segment ends with the horror frame intact, but the regular show's status quo restored. This is standard Treehouse of Horror procedure. Nothing that happens in these episodes carries forward into regular continuity. Lisa does not remember the death tome in the next episode. Mr. Burns is alive again in the following week's show. The polar ice caps are whatever they were before. The Halloween special gives the show a space to imagine its characters doing things they cannot do in canon, and then closes that space when the credits roll. What Death Tome accomplished that most Treehouse of Horror segments do not is a genuine emotional argument about a specific character's situation. The best Halloween specials, The Shining, Nightmare Cafeteria, Citizen Kang, use the horror frame to say something true about the characters inside it. Death Tome uses its horror frame to say something true about Lisa, that 33 seasons of regular episodes have shown, but never stated this directly, that her powerlessness is a specific and ongoing injustice, that the world she lives in does not deserve her patience, that the things she is angry about are real and serious, and not being adequately addressed by any of the tools the show normally gives her. The Notebook is the fantasy. The fantasy is that moral seriousness plus power equals change. The nightmare, the part that makes it a horror segment rather than an adventure story, is that the power does not stay moral, that the decision-making required to use it eats away at the person using it, that the gap between justice and the person executing justice closes and then disappears, and then the person executing justice becomes something they would not have recognized in themselves at the start. Lisa recognizes it in time. She puts the book down. The world goes back to what it was. She picks up her saxophone and plays, which is what she has always done, when the world will not change for her. The music goes nowhere. It is heard by no one who has the power to act on it. It is beautiful anyway. Cannot say any other way. The haunted house that preferred destruction to coexisting with the Simpsons. The aliens who were genuinely kind and were accused of planning murder. The poem that was too sincere to be a joke and became something better than a joke. The devil wearing the face of the nicest man in Springfield. The father who needed a television screen to stay human. The school that consumed its students through proper administrative channels. The dimension that made the most familiar cartoon face on television look wrong and strange and somehow threatening. The election that the monsters won completely fair and square. The groundskeeper who showed up to help every single time and got the axe every single time. The girl who finally held real power in her hands and had to choose between justice and the person she loved most. 10 cases, 34 years of Halloween television, one show that kept finding new things to say inside the same frame year after year, with the same family and the same drooling aliens and the same willingness to walk into whatever dark room the horror genre had available and see what was worth taking from it. The Treehouse of Horror is not the most important thing The Simpsons ever did. The Golden Era episodes, the character work, the years when the regular show was the best thing on American television, All of that sits above it in terms of what the show actually built and left behind. But the Halloween specials did something the regular episodes could not always do. They gave the show a space outside of consequence, outside of continuity, outside of the rules that kept the characters the same from week to week and year to year. In that space, Homer could go mad and freeze in the snow, and it meant something. Lisa could pick up a notebook and become something frightening, and it meant something. Willie could die 3 times in one episode, and it meant something. The meaning did not carry forward into the next episode. The next episode reset everything, but the meaning was there, in those 30 minutes once a year, fully present and fully felt. What the show understood from the very first Halloween special in 1990 was that horror and comedy are not pulling in opposite directions. They are pulling toward the same place. Both of them work by creating a gap between what the audience expects and what actually happens. Both of them depend on the audience caring enough about the characters involved to feel something when things go wrong. A joke that nobody cares about is not funny. A horror story about characters nobody cares about is not scary. The Simpsons had characters that 30 million people cared about deeply, and the Treehouse of Horror pointed those characters at the darkest available material and trusted the audience to hold the comedy and the horror at the same time. The audience held both, every year, for over 3 decades. Matt Groening was afraid The Raven was too pretentious. David X. Cohen was reaching back to a radio program that scared him as a child when he wrote Nightmare Cafeteria. Bill Oakley found the Homer Cubed idea in a Twilight Zone reference book sitting in the writer's room. David Merkin responded to complaints about violence by making the Halloween special more violent. Conan O'Brien wrote his last Simpsons script as a set of wraparound segments for a Halloween special, before leaving to host a late-night show. Pacific Data Images animated Homer in 3 dimensions for almost nothing because they wanted the world to see what they could do. These were people making something, making it carefully, and making it with genuine investment in the material they were working with. The Treehouse of Horror tradition is the record of that investment. 30-plus years of writers and animators and voice performers deciding, once a year, to take the horror genre seriously enough to find something true inside it. The haunted house is still standing in the first episode, its absence a shape in the empty lot where the Simpsons used to live. Kang and Kodos are still out there, somewhere above Rigel 7, making plans that will not work. The Raven is still perched above the door, saying its word. The devil is still Ned Flanders, smiling pleasantly. Willie still has the axe in his back. Lisa still put the notebook down. None of it happened. All of it is true. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.